Dwight David Eisenhower, the commander of D-Day and the 34th President of the United States, was born on October 14, 1890, in Denison, Texas. He was the third of 7 sons and was nicknamed Ike by his parents, a shortened form of their last name. Interestingly, all the Eisenhower boys were called some version of Ike as children, but only Dwight kept the nickname into adulthood. His early life was modest and working class, with no clear signs of the great achievements that lay ahead. Eisenhower's ancestry included German, English, and Scottish roots. On his father's side, he descended from German Protestant farmers who immigrated to Pennsylvania in the 1740s. A branch of the family moved to Kansas in the 1800s, where David Eisenhower met Ida Stover at Lane University. They married in 1885 and settled in Hope, Kansas. There, they opened a general store and welcomed their first son, Arthur. Unfortunately, the store failed due to a poor economy and dishonest business partners. Facing financial hardship, the family moved to Texas, where David used his engineering education to get a job with the Missouri-Texas-Kansas Railroad, earning $40 a month. They rented a small house in Denison and slowly began to recover financially. While living there, Edgar and Dwight were born. In 1892, the family returned to Kansas and settled in Abilene. That same year, Ida gave birth to their 4th son, Roy, and David took a job as a mechanic at the Bell Springs Creamery. He worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, earning $50 a month. The Eisenhowers made Abilene their permanent home, and Dwight always considered it his true hometown, despite being born in Texas. David and Ida raised their lively and competitive sons in a small, 800-square-foot house on the wrong side of the tracks in Abilene. However, the property had enough land for them to grow crops and keep animals. Combined with David's income, this helped the family get by. Dwight would later say of his childhood, "I never knew we were poor." The Eisenhower household emphasized strong values typical of the American plains: responsibility, hard work, faith, humility, modesty, honesty, and sincerity. Alongside their chores, each boy was given a plot of land to farm, and they were responsible for selling their crops to contribute to the family income. David was strict and disciplined any misbehavior firmly. Dwight, often hot-tempered, frequently got into fights with other boys both in and out of school. Religion played a significant role in the Eisenhower family's life. David and Ida were members of a Mennonite group called the Brethren of Christ, also known as the River Brethren, due to their practice of baptizing followers in rivers. In the spring of 1895, the Eisenhower family experienced a deep tragedy. Their 5th son, Paul, passed away from diphtheria at just 10 months old. As is often the case after such a loss, Ida's faith seemed to change. Several months earlier, she had begun attending meetings of the International Bible Students Association, an organization that would later become known as the Jehovah's Witnesses. After Paul's death, her involvement with the group grew stronger, and the local chapter started holding regular meetings at the Eisenhower home in Abilene. David and Ida were both pacifists and placed a strong emphasis on religious education in their household. They held daily Bible study sessions as a family. Ida, in particular, focused a lot on Dwight's spiritual growth, hoping to temper his fascination with wars and military history. By the time Dwight left home for college, he had read the entire Bible twice, and his knowledge of Scripture remained impressive throughout his life. However, despite the central role religion played in his childhood, Dwight never joined a church or followed any specific Christian denomination. Though he had ties to the Presbyterian Church through his wife, Marmee, He considered himself a deeply religious man, but his faith was something he largely kept private. Some historians speculate that this reluctance to discuss religion publicly may have been linked to his mother's involvement with the Jehovah's Witnesses, a group often viewed as a radical and fringe sect. Given the family's successful careers across various fields like law, banking, academia, and the military, they may have wanted to protect their public image. This was especially important during an era when religious affiliations, like John F. Kennedy's Catholicism, were considered controversial in American politics. In fact, Joe Biden, the current president, is only the second Catholic to hold the office. Abilene, where Dwight grew up, was typical of small-town America, surrounded by vast rural expanses. The Eisenhower children were exposed to both city and country life, though the rural experience was more familiar to them. Dwight, in particular, developed a strong love for the outdoors, especially hunting and fishing. Life was tough for the working class, but people believed that hard work and honesty could lead to success, no matter one's starting point. In a small town like Abilene, it was easier to achieve modest success than in a big city, and perhaps this sense of possibility helped shape Ike's later confidence and success. For much of his early education, Dwight was an average student. He enjoyed spelling and arithmetic, but it was history that became his true passion, especially military history. His mother, a former teacher, had a good collection of history books, and once Dwight started reading them, he became fascinated with the military exploits of historical figures like Hannibal and, of course, George Washington. While Dwight loved to read, he was also highly active and athletic. Football became his main interest, and the sport likely helped channel his energy and quick temper. At the age of 14, Dwight suffered a leg injury that led to a serious infection. His doctor recommended amputation, but Dwight refused, asking his parents to respect his decision not to go through with it, even if it meant risking his life. He preferred to take the chance that he might recover and keep the use of his leg. Fortunately, Dwight made a full recovery, and he went on to play football in both high school and college. Throughout his education, Dwight Eisenhower's academic performance was generally average, but his love for history and reading remained strong. Western novels were a particular favorite of his. He also displayed an interest and natural aptitude for mathematics and the sciences, which makes sense given that his father was a college-educated engineer. Later, Eisenhower's admirers would consider him a strategic and organizational genius. This knack for strategy even showed in his enjoyment of card games, especially poker and bridge, which he played and improved at throughout his life. His high school peers often predicted that he would become a successful history professor at an Ivy League college. However, financial constraints and personal interests led Eisenhower down a different path. In 1909, Dwight and his older brother Edgar graduated together from Abilene High School. Both wanted to attend college, but their family's income at the time wasn't enough to cover tuition for both sons. They agreed that Edgar would attend college first while Dwight worked at the creamery where their father was employed. Dwight would help pay for Edgar's education, with the understanding that Edgar would return the favor once he graduated. Dwight spent over a year working 6 days a week at the creamery, earning just $3 a week. Eventually, it was suggested to Dwight that attending a military academy might provide him with a tuition-free college education. His long-standing interest in military history and his energetic, sometimes fiery personality made him a natural fit for such an institution. A military academy would teach him structure, discipline, and the value of teamwork, traits that would later serve him well in his military and political careers. In 1911, with solid test scores and the recommendation from his congressman, Eisenhower was accepted into the United States Military Academy at West Point. His time there was formative and shaped much of his future approach to leadership and organization. Initially, Dwight wasn't as focused on a military career as he was on simply obtaining a college education and playing football. In his freshman year, Eisenhower had the opportunity to face the legendary Jim Thorpe, an Olympic gold medalist and Native American football player, in a 1912 game between West Point and the Carlisle Indian School. Eichand. His teammates tried to neutralize Thorpe by focusing their efforts on him, but despite their best attempts, Thorpe and his team led Carlisle to victory. The game marked Eisenhower's last as a player. He sustained a knee injury that would cause permanent damage, ending his football career. Though unable to play, Dwight transitioned into coaching the junior varsity team in his second year, a role he kept through graduation. This experience likely helped shape him into the leader he would later become, fostering traits like calmness, competence, and strategic thinking, while tempering his earlier impulsive and aggressive tendencies. Although his academic record was average, Eisenhower excelled in certain subjects, especially English and history, finishing 10th in his class in those subjects. He graduated 61st out of 164 cadets overall. Despite his less than stellar academic and discipline rankings, he was 125th in discipline. Eisenhower formed lasting friendships at West Point. Many of his classmates would go on to play significant roles in World War II, with 59 of them eventually becoming generals, including Eisenhower himself and Omar Bradley. The class of 1915 became famously known as the class the stars fell on. After graduation, Ike's life took a dramatic turn. Within a year, his future military career began to unfold, and he also met and fell in love with his future wife. He chose the infantry and was assigned to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. It was there that he met Mary Dowd, known as Mammy, the charming and vivacious daughter of a wealthy meatpacking family from Denver, Colorado. The Dowds spent their winters in Texas, and soon Mammy and Ike were inseparable. Mammy later recalled, "He was just about the handsomest man I'd ever seen," speaking of the fair-haired, blue-eyed man who would become her husband. Ike proposed to Mammy on Valentine's Day in 1916, and they were married that July. Their first son, Dowd, affectionately nicknamed Icky, was born the following year. Despite attempts to be posted overseas for a more active role, Eisenhower spent most of the next few years in junior officer training, coaching football for Peacock Military Academy and St. Louis College, training units, or serving in supply and logistics positions. Though he wasn't involved in combat, his organizational, administrative, and leadership skills began to shine during this period. These qualities served him well during World War I, even though he was repeatedly denied the opportunity for real military action. During this time, Eisenhower also formed opinions on how the military should evolve, particularly regarding strategy and technology. Like many of his contemporaries, he recognized the value of tanks and firepower over traditional infantry offensives. He trained tank regiments in Georgia in 1917 and Pennsylvania in 1918. In 1919, Eisenhower helped organize a transcontinental vehicle convoy from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, which taught him valuable lessons about the capabilities of tanks and trucks on different terrains. The 3,200-mile, 62-day journey was a massive undertaking, with over 80 vehicles and many breakdowns due to poor roads. This experience convinced him of the need for a national highway system, an infrastructure project that would later become a key push to depart for Europe with his unit. On November 18, 1918, But a week before his departure, the armistice was announced. Ike was deeply disappointed, as military reputation was typically earned through distinguished combat service, and he feared his career might stagnate without it. In hindsight, however, this might have been a blessing. Many soldiers were unprepared for the brutal realities of modern warfare, and the casualty rates were staggering. Instead, Eisenhower spent these years with his young family, learning and building his career without the horrors of battle. In 1920, Marmee and Icky, who had been staying with her parents for a while, rejoined Ike at Camp Meade, Pennsylvania. They lived next door to George Patton, who quickly became a close friend. Both men shared a passion for experimenting with military strategy and equipment, and their personal and professional relationship would last through 3 decades and a world war. In January 1921, tragedy struck when their 3-year-old son, Icky, died from scarlet fever after contracting the disease from a maid Ike and Marmee had hired, who had resumed work before fully recovering from her illness. Devastated, Ike and Marmee blamed themselves. The loss profoundly affected their marriage, and Ike rarely spoke of it. He later wrote, "This was the greatest disappointment and disaster in my life, the one I have never been able to forget completely." A year after Icky's death, their second and only surviving son, John, was born, bringing some joy and comfort back to their lives. Every year, Ike would send Marmee flowers on the anniversary of Icky's passing. Although some historians view Eisenhower's career during the interwar years as stagnant, since he did not rise above the rank of lieutenant colonel before World War II, this period was. Ike, Marmee, and baby John spent 2 years in Panama. The Canal Zone was a desolate, undeveloped area, not the most stimulating environment for Marmee or their child. However, they made do, and Ike's duties were relatively light. Connor encouraged him to spend his spare time reading extensively, particularly on history, philosophy, and military strategy. Ike took full advantage of this time and learned a great deal. He came to realize that Connor's mentorship was part of a larger plan. Connor believed another world war was on the horizon, and he saw Ike as one of the best prepared men for high military command when it came. Eisenhower returned to Camp Meade in 1924, and with Connor's support, was admitted to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he excelled. The curriculum was rigorous, but Eisenhower graduated first in a class of 275 in 1926. The following year, Connor helped Eisenhower secure a position with the American Battle Monuments Commission in Washington, D.C., where he was tasked with writing a history of the American Expeditionary Forces service during World War I. Later in 1927, he was admitted to the Army War College in Washington, D.C., and again graduated first in his class in 1928. In 1929, Ike and Marmee moved to France, where Eisenhower was tasked with touring and documenting World War I battle sites. Afterward, he was assigned to the War Department in Washington, where he worked on strategies for industrial mobilization in case of future conflict. In 1930, he met the new Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, who was impressed by Eisenhower's intelligence and competence. MacArthur declared, "This is the best damn officer in the Army," and, like Connor before him, worked to promote Eisenhower's career. Throughout the 1930s, Eisenhower worked closely with MacArthur, assisting him in formulating military strategies. In 1935, Ike accompanied MacArthur to the Philippines, where the general was advising President Manuel Quezon on defense plans. The Philippines were in a transitional phase toward independence, and the U.S. feared a Japanese invasion. Eisenhower spent the next 4 years attempting to implement MacArthur's defensive strategy, which included building a citizen army capable of defending the region with minimal U.S. support, though the Philippines would fall to the Japanese in 1942. Eisenhower carried out his duties as best he could under the circumstances. Religion played a significant role in the Eisenhower family's life. David and Ida were members of a Mennonite group called the Brethren of Christ, also known as the River Brethren, due to their practice of baptizing followers in rivers. In the spring of 1895, the Eisenhower family experienced a deep tragedy. Their fifth son, Paul, passed away from diphtheria at just 10 months old. As is often the case after such a loss, Ida's faith seemed to change. Several months earlier, she had begun attending meetings of the International Bible Students Association, an organization that would later become known as the Jehovah's Witnesses. After Paul's death, her involvement with the group grew stronger, and the local chapter started holding regular meetings at the Eisenhower home in Abilene. David and Ida were both pacifists and placed a strong emphasis on religious education in their household. They held daily Bible study sessions as a family. Ida, in particular, focused a lot on Dwight's spiritual growth, hoping to temper his fascination with wars and military history. By the time Dwight left home for college, he had read the entire Bible twice, and his knowledge of Scripture remained impressive throughout his life. However, despite the central role religion played in his childhood, Dwight never joined a church or followed any specific Christian denomination. Though he had ties to the Presbyterian Church through his wife, Mommy, he considered himself a deeply religious man, but his faith was something he largely kept private. Some historians speculate that this reluctance to discuss religion publicly may have been linked to his mother's involvement with the Jehovah's Witnesses, a group often viewed as a radical and fringe sect. Given the family's successful careers across various fields like law, banking, academia, and the military, they may have wanted to protect their public image. This was especially important during an era when religious affiliations, like John F. Kennedy's Catholicism, were considered controversial in American politics. In fact, Joe Biden, the current president, is only the second Catholic to hold the office. Abilene, where Dwight grew up, was typical of small-town America, surrounded by vast rural expanses. The Eisenhower children were exposed to both city and country life, though the rural experience was more familiar to them. Dwight, in particular, developed a strong love for the outdoors, especially hunting and fishing. Life was tough for the working class, but people believed that hard work and honesty could lead to success, no matter one's starting point. In a small town like Abilene, it was easier to achieve modest success than in a big city, and perhaps this sense of possibility helped shape Ike's later confidence and success. For much of his early education, Dwight was an average student. He enjoyed spelling and arithmetic, but it was history that became his true passion, especially military history. His mother, a former teacher, had a good collection of history books, and once Dwight started reading them, he became fascinated with the military exploits of historical figures like Hannibal and, of course, George Washington. While Dwight loved to read, he was also highly active and athletic. Football became his main interest, and the sport likely helped channel his energy and quick temper. At the age of 14, Dwight suffered a leg injury that led to a serious infection. His doctor recommended amputation, but Dwight refused, asking his parents to respect his decision not to go through with it, even if it meant risking his life. He preferred to take the chance that he might recover and keep the use of his leg. Fortunately, Dwight made a full recovery, and he went on to play football in both high school and college. Eisenhower's first major test in World War II came in the North African theater. Although the operation was ultimately successful, it was marked by missed opportunities, logistical problems, and costly mistakes. Ike later remarked that students at the General Staff College in Washington would criticize the performance in North Africa for decades. However, the lessons Eisenhower learned during the campaign helped shape his leadership going forward. Operation Torch, the largest amphibious invasion in military history up to that point, pitted Ike against the famous German General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox. Rommel's forces had been struggling against the British Eighth Army, led by General Montgomery, in the Western Desert Campaign. The Allies successfully captured key ports along the northwest coast, Oran, Casablanca, and Algiers, before pushing east toward Tunisia. The Eighth Army advanced west, and by May 1943, the Tunisian campaign ended with the surrender of Axis forces. Many believed the North African theater had dragged on too long, as Eisenhower had been overly cautious on several occasions and struggled to address personnel and supply issues decisively. Although the Allies captured over 250,000 German prisoners, Rommel and most of his forces had escaped. Eisenhower would face Rommel again on the Western Front. One of Ike's greatest strengths was his ability to learn from his mistakes. Going forward, he made a conscious decision to act more decisively and to focus more on logistics and personnel management. He became tougher on himself and on the men under his command, though they respected him greatly. Ike wasn't the inspirational kind of general. Many of the more famous generals, like Patton or Montgomery, were known for their charisma and emotional leadership. They inspired loyalty, but often had difficult personalities. Eisenhower, by contrast, was plain-spoken, respectful, and compassionate. He was a conciliator who never shied away from taking responsibility when things went wrong. His troops didn't view him with the same reverence as they did generals like Patton or Montgomery, but they knew he cared deeply about them. One notable instance of Ike's ability to avoid diva squabbling occurred during Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Patton and Montgomery were so focused on competing with one another that their rivalry nearly disrupted the operation. Eisenhower skillfully managed the situation and kept the focus on the mission rather than personal egos. Rather than coordinating a swift takeover of the island to maintain the Allied momentum, the British and American forces ended up competing in a race to capture Messina. In the meantime, the Axis powers managed to evacuate 100,000 soldiers, 10,000 vehicles, and 17,000 tons of supplies, which they would use to reinforce and defend the Italian mainland. As a result, the Allies would face a literal, uphill battle as they advanced up the Italian peninsula to secure victory. In fact, the fascists in Italy continued to resist even after the fall of Berlin in 1945, as the war was nearing its end. In December 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt chose Eisenhower to plan and execute what would become known as D-Day. For most historians and admirers of Eisenhower, this mission was his magnum opus, his greatest achievement. Aware that 60 German divisions, led by his old adversary Rommel, awaited him, Eisenhower meticulously planned the final stages of the war, drawing from the lessons he had learned throughout his 30-year military career, especially regarding collaboration, delegation, strategy, logistics, and tactics. The Germans knew that an Allied invasion of Western Europe was imminent, but they were unsure where or when it would take place. Eisenhower, having learned the importance of surprise from previous campaigns, he also organized fake invasions at other sites along the French coast. These decoy operations included inflatable tanks and parachute dummies to confuse the Germans, who were left uncertain for weeks after the initial landings. The Allies also used deception techniques such as airdropping thin strips of metal to disrupt German radar, creating fake radio traffic for the enemy to intercept, and sending double agents to feed misleading intelligence. The D-Day invasion itself, still the largest amphibious assault in military history, saw 156,000 Allied troops from the US, Britain, and Canada establish a beachhead around 10 miles deep into German-occupied territory. Eisenhower gave General Patton and his troops the green light to break through German defenses quickly and decisively. Within weeks, the Allies had landed 2 million additional troops, tens of thousands of vehicles, and a vast amount of supplies. The westward push across Europe had begun. Now fully confident in his ability to act decisively and aggressively, Eisenhower faced a new challenge in the form of the German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. By the fall of 1944, Hitler had correctly predicted that Germany would soon be overrun. The Soviets were advancing from the east, while the Allies were pressing from the west. In an attempt to delay the inevitable, the Germans launched a desperate counterattack in the Ardennes region of northern France and Belgium. Hitler's goal was to drive the Allies back, seize Antwerp, and disrupt their supply lines, potentially forcing them to sign a peace treaty with Germany and buying time to focus on the Soviet threat. The Battle of the Bulge was pivotal. Both sides were exhausted and facing constant supply issues. Leaders on both sides understood that the outcome of this battle would likely determine the war's final result. The Germans sent 400,000 troops, nearly twice the number of Allied forces in the region, along with about 10% more tanks. Initially, the Germans gained ground, pushing back the British and American forces and besieging several towns. Some German divisions even advanced as far as 5 miles from the Meuse River. The weather initially helped the Germans, as it grounded Allied air support. However, once the skies cleared in January, Allied planes ravaged the German supply lines, while the remaining German Luftwaffe struggled to fight back. As the Germans ran out of supplies, Eisenhower masterminded a strong defense in key locations in the Ardennes. Despite the heavy fighting, the Allies held their ground, and the Germans were eventually forced to retreat. They suffered devastating losses, nearly as many casualties as the Allies, 600 tanks, and most of their air force. With the Germans in retreat, the war appeared to be nearing its conclusion, except for the final mopping up operations. Although most historians consider D-Day to be Eisenhower's crowning achievement, the Battle of the Bulge holds equal significance for some. It was his one true test as a field commander on the ground, the glory he had longed for but had been denied during World War I when he was kept stateside. It was during this critical moment that Eisenhower's leadership truly shone. After Germany's surrender, Eisenhower stayed in Europe to oversee the Allied occupation and help organize the Nuremberg trials. Under American policy, which viewed most Germans as victims of the Nazi regime, Eisenhower ensured that adequate food supplies were provided to the local populace and labor was available to rebuild vital infrastructure. He also emphasized documenting the atrocities of the Holocaust, commissioning extensive photographic and video evidence. Eisenhower was deeply horrified by the death camps and recognized the need to preserve this evidence. He foresaw that future propagandists might deny the reality of the Holocaust, claiming that such horrific crimes were too extreme to be believed. Eisenhower returned to the U.S. in the summer of 1945 to a hero's welcome. With President Roosevelt's death before the war's end, Ike became the most popular man in America, and many influential figures encouraged him to run for president. In 1948, including President Truman, who even offered to serve as his vice president if Eisenhower joined the Democratic Party. However, Eisenhower, wary of entering the political arena due to his military background and lack of political experience, hesitated. At the age of 56, he preferred a less demanding occupation after his wartime service. Instead, he accepted an offer to become president of Columbia University in 1948. That same year, his memoir, Crusade in Europe, was published and became an instant bestseller. For the first time, Eisenhower had financial security. During his 2 years at Columbia, Eisenhower had a mixed experience. He founded the Institute of War and Peace Studies to research the causes and effects of war and established an informal council on foreign relations to deliberate on foreign policy. While these efforts provided opportunities for interaction with political, military, and intellectual leaders, Eisenhower found himself less involved in educational policy and daily university life. Some faculty members looked down on him, perceiving him as unsophisticated due to his lack of formal education and his love for Western novels. This tension, combined with his limited engagement with students and faculty, led to his resignation in 1950. He returned to Europe in 1951, this time as Supreme Commander of NATO, where he helped build a strong military alliance to counter the growing threat of communism and defend democracy. After returning to the U.S. in 1951, Eisenhower made a persuasive appeal to Congress, convincing them to support NATO. As public support for his potential presidential run grew, President Truman once again approached him, offering to back his candidacy as a Democrat. Eisenhower, who had never publicly declared a political affiliation, declined and eventually declared himself a Republican, setting the stage for a contentious relationship with Truman and the bitter rivalry during the 1952 election campaign. This version preserves the meaning while keeping the narrative smooth and clear. Ike's political declaration sparked a draft Eisenhower movement within the Republican Party. Understanding that his primary opponent for the party nomination, Robert A. Taft, was more focused on domestic policy than international affairs, and recognizing that all his efforts for global security might be at risk in a more isolationist America, Ike decided to enter the race. The famous "I like Ike" buttons began appearing everywhere, and the catchy television jingle, also called "I Like Ike," became an anthem, with voters humming it under their breath. Despite Eisenhower's own preference for a more reserved and dignified campaign focused on his solid track record, his campaign took on a notably populist tone. In November 1952, he won an impressive victory over the Democratic candidate, Adlai Stevenson, securing the votes from every state in the Electoral College except for the South and capturing 55% of the popular vote. He would repeat this success even more convincingly in 1956, achieving a landslide victory over Stevenson once again. Although Eisenhower was one of the oldest presidents elected in decades, he remained an active and dedicated leader. As president, he worked tirelessly while also delegating responsibilities efficiently. He kept up with his hobbies, including reading, playing poker and bridge, attending baseball and football games, and, more recently, pursuing landscape painting, a hobby he was pleasantly surprised to find he was good at. Eisenhower's two-term presidency saw massive economic growth, social changes, and escalating international tensions. Ike is typically remembered as a president who was more concerned with foreign policy than domestic issues, and indeed, he gave top priority to Cold War developments. However, his reluctance to encroach on constitutional conventions, such as states' rights and the separation of powers, has led some to interpret his actions as a lack of commitment to pressing social issues, particularly civil rights. Although Eisenhower campaigned in the segregationist South and aimed to win both white and black voters, he refrained from condemning the segregationists directly. Instead, he implemented full desegregation in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Armed Forces, and the Foreign Service. He encouraged the recruitment of African Americans into government positions and privately denounced the efforts of white supremacists to prevent black people from voting. The reports of violence against successful black Americans in the South angered him, yet he refrained from taking a more activist role in the civil rights movement or in advocating against racism. His reluctance to speak out publicly on issues like the racially motivated murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955 or the bombing of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s home in 1956 deeply disappointed many black voters and civil rights leaders. Several later presidents would be more outspoken against racial extremism and more openly supportive of civil rights. Eisenhower viewed bold action on civil rights as potentially destabilizing if changes came too rapidly. He also believed that, as president, he could not usurp the legislative powers of Congress. Although he could dismantle structural racism within the federal government, comprehensive civil rights legislation had to be passed by Congress, which had shifted back to Democratic control in 1954. However, Eisenhower did have the power to appoint Supreme Court justices with civil rights sympathies. He appointed two such justices, including Chief Justice Earl Warren, whose opinion in the Brown v. Board of Education case struck down the segregationist Plessy v. Ferguson decision. Eisenhower also took action to enforce the Brown decision in the South when states resisted school desegregation. In 1957, when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus defied federal authority by blocking the desegregation of Little Rock High School, Eisenhower sent federal troops to enforce the integration. He had initially negotiated with Faubus to allow peaceful integration, but when the governor reneged on his promise, Eisenhower took control of the Arkansas National Guard to ensure the safe integration of 9 black students, despite an overwhelming and hostile white student body. Eisenhower's civil rights record was further criticized for his continuation of Native American assimilation policies. Native American leaders accused his administration of pushing for the removal of Native Americans from federal jurisdiction and the abolition of the reservation system, which they believed threatened their culture and way of life. They also charged that Washington was violating centuries-old treaty agreements and attempting to force Native Americans, who saw themselves as distinct nations, to assimilate into mainstream American culture. Eisenhower also faced criticism for his failure to publicly condemn the actions of Senator Joseph McCarthy during the Red Scare. Many people who suffered under McCarthy's witch hunts, including government employees suspected of communist ties, accused Eisenhower of not speaking out against McCarthy's unconstitutional attacks on privacy and free speech. Those accused of having communist sympathies were targeted, but so were civil rights activists, many of whom were wrongly associated with communism. The gay and lesbian community was also targeted during the Red Scare, not due to political affiliation, but because their perceived lack of moral fiber supposedly made them susceptible to blackmail by communist spies, thus rendering them untrustworthy. This mass firing of gay and lesbian employees from government positions became known as the Lavender Scare and played a significant role in sparking the early gay liberation movement, which would gain greater momentum by the late 1960s. While Eisenhower personally disliked McCarthy, he refrained from intervening in his campaign against domestic communism, except when McCarthy sought to issue congressional subpoenas to White House staff. In response, Eisenhower became the first president to invoke and fully define the principle of Executive privilege. Eisenhower believed that political stability and national security were best served by keeping certain access to the executive branch privileged, especially in relation to someone as ruthless and dishonest as McCarthy. As president, Eisenhower is most often praised for presiding over one of the largest economic expansions in American history, helping the nation achieve some of the world's best living standards. The American automobile, construction, retail, and service industries all experienced explosive growth in the aftermath of World War II. Unemployment dropped to historic lows, and an unprecedented number of American families began purchasing cars, homes, and other consumer goods, while also enjoying annual vacations. American productivity and job creation owed much to the infrastructure built during the war, particularly the automobile industry. Although members of the Democratic Party claimed that the New Deal programs and the GI Bill, neither of which Eisenhower had a hand in, were key to America's post-war prosperity, there is truth in these claims. Ike did not pioneer the farming subsidy programs, Social Security Administration, or the infrastructure that promoted fair labor practices. Nor was he responsible for the GI Bill, which helped former soldiers and their families adjust to the booming economy. However, Eisenhower played a crucial role in facilitating economic growth. He worked to disentangle private industries from government finances, many of which had relied heavily on government contracts during the war. Eisenhower also kept tax rates high for top earners, capital gains, and wealthy estates, decisions that put him at odds with more conservative members of his own party. The resulting tax surplus allowed him to expand Social Security, benefiting an additional 10 million American workers by providing them access to unemployment insurance and pensions. Although Ike had not been a fan of the New Deal during his younger years, his exposure to Roosevelt's administration in the 1930s had cemented his largely conservative outlook. He was no longer under any illusion about the benefits of social welfare programs. By the 1950s, Eisenhower famously declared that any political party trying to dismantle the New Deal now would be negligible and stupid. One of Eisenhower's most significant contributions to America's economic expansion was his pioneering of the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. Originally conceived as a way to quickly evacuate urban areas in case of a nuclear attack, the nationwide highway system had far-reaching effects. It opened up national markets for trade, put small towns on the map, encouraged leisure travel, and spurred the creation of businesses catering to highway travelers. By the 1950s, Eisenhower's America boasted the world's highest standard of living. In terms of foreign policy, Eisenhower faced the monumental task of representing America on the global stage at the onset of the nuclear era. His views on both communism and nuclear weapons had evolved since World War II. Ike had been in Russia when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and he had been horrified by it, believing it did more harm than good. He thought the Japanese were close enough to surrender that the bomb's use was unnecessary, though historians still debate this point. Eisenhower also felt that the United States' use of nuclear weapons had more than anything else fueled Soviet distrust, leading to increasing tensions in the years that followed. Despite this, Eisenhower was still hopeful in the immediate post-war period, believing the Soviets might prefer friendship to competition with the US. But by 1948, after the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb and tensions over Germany's economic recovery and Greece's civil war escalated, Eisenhower's stance on communism hardened. He came to believe, as many of his Republican colleagues did, that the best way to secure American interests and maintain world peace was through a policy of containment, backed by the threat of military action or nuclear strikes. Impressions of Eisenhower's handling of the Cold War remain mixed. Modern critics, in particular, have condemned some of the CIA's actions under his administration, including the overthrow of elected governments in Iran and Guatemala. These operations are often seen as having less to do with containing communism and more with installing governments friendly to U.S. economic interests. These actions made Iranian oil available to U.S. and British companies and prevented the nationalization and fair distribution of land among Guatemalans, allowing large-scale American agricultural corporations to maintain dominance in the region. The containment of communism in Latin America and the Middle East remained a central aspect of American foreign policy in the years that followed. The Eisenhower Doctrine, which provided military support to Middle Eastern countries resisting Soviet communism, significantly impacted the geopolitical stability of the region during his presidency. He was praised for his role in resolving the Suez Crisis in Egypt, but overall, American policies in the Middle East were often at odds with Arab countries, who viewed Zionist imperialism as a greater threat than communism. These countries resented American and British support for Israel. In principle, Eisenhower favored liberating communist countries rather than simply containing them. But he understood that, in this new era of nuclear warfare, constant military engagement was not a sustainable approach. This is evident in his handling of the Korean War, his subsequent strategy of nuclear brinkmanship with Communist China, and his policies in Southeast Asia. The death of Stalin made it easier to resolve the Korean War, as it created a power vacuum that made China more vulnerable to U.S. military threats, which Eisenhower was not hesitant to use in order to force China to withdraw from the Korean peninsula. Eisenhower also played a key role in formulating the U.S. policy of supporting Taiwan against China's territorial ambitions. Eisenhower was reluctant to commit more than financial support and military advisors to the defense of French Indochina, and later, South Vietnam. His initially minimal involvement in fighting communism in Vietnam eventually escalated under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations into a prolonged and undeclared war, costing the lives of 50,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese troops and civilians. President Kennedy also inherited the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, a plan originally developed by the Eisenhower administration, which contributed to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Because Eisenhower's foreign policy discouraged full-scale war, his approach to dealing with the Soviet Union's expansion and nuclear capabilities involved complex negotiations and the maintenance of America's nuclear arsenal. Eisenhower's admirers praise his efforts toward nuclear disarmament, even though they were not successful. When the Soviets detonated their first hydrogen bomb, Eisenhower defied his cabinet's advice and proposed mutual nuclear disarmament through a campaign called Atoms for Peace. He suggested that both superpowers could decommission their weapons and repurpose them for nuclear power plants to benefit both nations. While Eisenhower consistently sought to avoid a nuclear arms race, he was also willing to expand the U.S. nuclear stockpile as the Soviet arsenal grew. Eisenhower's open skies policy, which proposed mutual inspections of nuclear sites, was also rejected by the Soviets. Ultimately, neither side was willing to be the first to trust the other enough to disarm or permit UN-supervised inspections. The Eisenhower administration was significantly embarrassed by the U-2 incident, in which the U.S. approved one last covert surveillance flight over the Soviet Union before a summit with the Russians. When the Soviet Union shot down the plane and captured the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, the Soviet leadership publicly revealed that Eisenhower had lied about the existence of the U-2 flight. Furious at Ike's refusal to apologize, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev cancelled the summit and withdrew Eisenhower's invitation to visit the Soviet Union. Throughout his presidency, Eisenhower became increasingly frustrated with the exorbitant costs of American foreign policy. He had dramatically reduced funding for conventional military forces and poured resources into developing a nuclear strategy that relied on the principle of assured mutual destruction to keep the U.S. safe. Eisenhower also came to see the space race as wasteful, famously referring to any administration that would spend $40 billion on a race to the moon as nuts. By the end of his presidency, Eisenhower was most concerned about the growing influence of the military-industrial complex and its potential to undermine American democracy. He had made efforts to reduce excessive government and military funding to private companies after World War II, but in the face of the arms race with the Soviets, he was unable to prevent weapons manufacturers from claiming an ever larger share of American taxpayer money. When Eisenhower left office, he handed over the reins of government to John F. Kennedy, who had defeated Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, in the 1960 election. Accompanied by Secret Service personnel, Ike and Marmee left the White House and retired to their farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Ike's retirement was both peaceful and active. It allowed him more time with Mamie, their son John, and their grandchildren. He wrote 3 more memoirs between 1963 and 1967 and continued to pursue his hobbies, including poker, bridge, landscape painting, and a relatively new interest, golf. He also remained involved in supporting Republican candidates during his retirement. Eisenhower's health had been in decline since 1955 when he suffered his first heart attack. However, Vice President Nixon and Eisenhower's cabinet did everything they could to downplay the severity of his health problems to the public. Over the next decade, Ike suffered 4 more heart attacks, the final one leaving him severely debilitated. By 1968, he was permanently hospitalized. Eisenhower passed away from heart failure on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78. His body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda for several days before being interred in his hometown of Abilene, Kansas, at the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. He was buried next to his wife Mamie and their beloved son, Ike. As with many globally significant figures of the 20th century, arguably one of the most turbulent periods in modern history, Eisenhower's legacy is complicated and frequently debated. As one of the greatest heroes among the Allies during World War II, his contributions to victory are indisputable, placing him alongside other Allied leaders like Montgomery, Patton, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and de Gaulle in terms of influence. It is interesting, then, that while biographies on Eisenhower began to emerge almost immediately after World War II and more have been published in the decades since, Ike is far less visible in popular culture, iconography, and historical accounts compared to these other prominent figures. Historians in the 1960s and immediately after his death were often critical of Eisenhower's presidency, particularly regarding his silence or inaction on civil rights issues and what they perceived as his failure to prevent the escalation of the Cold War. However, by the late 1970s and 1980s, a new wave of conservative historians emerged, offering different perspectives to rehabilitate Eisenhower's reputation from earlier criticisms. These historians credited him with greater political skill than he had previously been given credit for. However, post-revisionist historians also criticized his leadership within the Republican Party, accusing him of failing to unite the party or sufficiently support Nixon in the 1960 election against John F. Kennedy. This back and forth of historical perspectives continues, but Eisenhower consistently ranks among the top 10 U.S. presidents in various polls. His most ardent supporters point to his presidency as a time of exceptional economic and infrastructural development, emphasizing that under his leadership, NATO remained intact, communism was effectively contained, and the Cold War remained cold. Some even credit Eisenhower with preventing a Third World War. Further research into this fascinating figure is undoubtedly necessary. While many have viewed his politics as notably right-wing, Eisenhower himself described his political philosophy as progressive conservatism. He believed in improving productivity, efficiency, and quality of life while maintaining fiscal and political stability. This moderate, blended approach to politics would likely be difficult to sustain in today's polarized political climate, characterized by intense tribalism and division. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Eisenhower's legacy is his dual role in the era of hypermilitarism and nuclear weapons. He both contributed to and, at times, tried to mitigate this new age of weapons. This paradox, actively building up nuclear capabilities while attempting to reduce their dangers, continues to influence international relations today. Above all, Eisenhower's story resonates strongly with those who believe in the American dream. The poor boy from rural, small-town America, no more remarkable than any other, rose to become one of modern history's greatest military heroes and was elected president twice. What do you think of Dwight D. Eisenhower? Was he a weak party leader who avoided addressing many important issues of his time? Or was he one of World War II's greatest generals whose leadership made him a beloved president? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching.